Helen Elizabeth Bailey was born on the 22nd of August, 1964 in Northumberland, England. She was a popular children's author and is probably most remembered for her series The Crazy World of Electra Brown. She had originally intended to become a forensic scientist but quickly fell in love with media and worked on marketing and licensing campaigns for characters in the Rugrats and Garfield. When Helen was 23, she met the man who would later become her husband. In 1996, she married John Simfield, the head of a licensing rights company, and she soon started writing more, throwing herself into her children and teenage stories. This creative outlet quickly turned into a flourishing career, and her books were incredibly popular and well-loved. But in February 2011, tragedy struck. She and her husband John were holidaying in Barbados when he went for a morning swim in the sea. But before long, Helen heard John cry out from the water. He had become caught in a riptide, and tragically, he drowned. They had been together for 22 years. By way of helping the grieving process, Helen threw herself into her writing. She started a blog called Planet Grief. It was a way of processing her own emotions, and it allowed for others affected by grief and loss to reach out and share their stories too. Very much a community-based blog where anyone was welcome, Helen would post suggested readings and websites that might help other people through the various stages of grief. Her openness and honesty made her easy to connect with, and through her blog and her memoir, she helped many other people going through the same things. It was through Planet Grief that, in October 2011, Helen met Ian Stewart. Ian's wife Diane had died very suddenly in 2010. Their relationship began just as supportive friends, but they soon became a lot closer, and Helen would describe their union as two grieving families coming together. The pair began dating and eventually became engaged. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. They moved into a beautiful gated home together in the picturesque town of Royston in Hertfordshire. They lived with Ian's 2 sons and Helen's beloved dog, Boris, who had come from Helen's marriage to John. It seemed that after so much tragedy in both of their lives, they had eventually found happiness again. However, on the 15th of April, just before 4 p.m., 999 received a phone call. As well as her home in Royston, she had another property in Kent by the seaside, somewhere she would often go to write and take some time for herself. But it was clear that neither she nor anyone else had been there in quite some time. By all accounts, it appeared that Helen had left a few days prior with her dog Boris to get some space and clear her head. But nobody had heard from her since, and this was extremely out of character for Helen. Her neighbors and close friends wondered if her stressful work schedule had caused her to drop off the grid for a while. Days turned into weeks, and with no trace of Helen turning up anywhere, 6 weeks after Helen disappeared, the police started to expand their search. They also took another look at her seaside cottage in Broadstairs, Kent, and examined her Wi-Fi router. Her phone had been going to voicemail since she had last been seen on Monday, April 11th. But it seemed that on April 16th there was a glimmer of hope that she had in fact been there. Helen Bailey's mobile phone had briefly connected to the Wi-Fi in her cottage. Police wondered if Helen had in fact been in Broadstairs the whole time. Following this, a closer look at her bank transactions gave them more hope that Helen was still out there, as there had been activity on her account. A new appeal was made, and police now wondered if Helen was using another name to avoid being detected. Further analysis of the account showed that a standing order from Helen's personal account to her joint account had been increased. It had gone from £600 a month to £4,000 a month. Her bank card had also been used to renew an Arsenal season ticket costing £3,000. It soon became clear that it wasn't Helen moving this money around at all. It was her partner, Ian Stewart. Police went back to the house that Ian shared with Helen. They knew they urgently needed to speak to him. But Ian wasn't there. He had left to go on a 2-week Spanish holiday that both he and Helen were meant to go on together. Neighbors were baffled that Ian had left the country with everything going on at the time. But detectives sat tight and waited for him to return. On July 11th, 3 months after Helen Bailey had last been seen, officers arrived at the home she shared with Ian, and just after 7 a.m., Ian was arrested. Police carried out a more extensive search of the couple's property, and on July 15th, they finally found Helen Bailey. Her body was discovered in the house's cesspit beneath the garage. Alongside her body was her beloved dog, Boris. It was determined that she had been suffocated, but it was inconclusive as to whether or not she was suffocated and definitely dead before she was put in there, or whether she suffocated to death while inside the cesspit. It was a truly harrowing and terrifying question. DCI Kent said of Ian, "He knows every time he uses the facilities in the house, that's where it's going. That's an incredibly cruel and cynical way to dispose of someone you claim to love and were set to marry." Ian had purposely parked the Jeep over the top of the cesspit during the police's initial searches to prevent it from being detected. Ian Stewart was subsequently charged with the murder of Helen Bailey. It seemed that Ian had been plotting for quite some time. Helen Bailey had written up her will in 2012, in which she had left her fortune to her brother John, stepson Daniel, and friend Jenny. But in 2014, she changed it so that Ian would inherit the majority of her assets and he wouldn't be left financially vulnerable. Helen also took out a life insurance policy to cover a potential £1.2 million inheritance tax bill in case she died before they got married. Several months before Helen was killed, in February of 2016, Ian began giving her the sleeping aid Zopiclone, which had been prescribed to him for sleeping problems. He often crushed it up and put it in her breakfast in the morning. Over the next few months, Helen became concerned about her energy levels and sleeping. She made several internet searches that included, "Why do I keep falling asleep?" and "falling asleep in the afternoon." On Monday, April 11th, 2016, Helen spent the morning looking at wedding venues and sending emails. Sometime between 10:51 a.m. and 2:30 p.m., Ian drugged Helen into a stupefied state, but the timing of her death is still inconclusive. He disposed of her body in the cesspit beneath the garage of the house, and shortly after, he threw in her dog Boris as well. It was a truly callous and cold-hearted crime. After this, Ian increased the standing order to transfer money from Helen's bank accounts to their joint Santander account. Ian was supposed to visit the doctor's surgery just before 3 p.m., but he phoned the GP and said he was having car trouble and asked to rearrange his appointment for later on. After he visited the GP, he was caught on camera making a trip to the refuse center to dispose of a duvet. Following this, he met with Helen's solicitor and tried to hastily push through the sale of one of Helen's houses. Helen's solicitor described him as quite aggressive. He refused to discuss the matter any further on the basis that Helen wasn't present. That evening, Ian went to watch his son play bowls before buying a Chinese takeaway for them both. He sent a text message to her phone, with just 2 kisses in the message. A few days passed and Helen's family and friends were becoming concerned that they hadn't heard from her. They contacted Ian, which prompted him to phone the police and report her as missing. No one saw the notes that Helen allegedly left on the side, and police believed it was all part of a web of lies that Ian was spinning. On April 16, 2016, Ian drove to Helen's cottage in Kent with her mobile phone. When he got there, Helen's phone briefly connected to the Wi-Fi. He then continued to live his life as if nothing had happened. DCI Jerome Kent, who led the investigation, said Ian Stewart was the most bizarre, manipulative, greedy, and self-centered man he had ever met. The murder appeared to be based on nothing more than pure greed. In January of 2017, the trial of Ian Stewart began. In his own defense, Ian Stewart claimed that Helen and her dog Boris had been kidnapped on April 11th, 2016 by 2 men called Nick and Joe. He said he hadn't told the police about this to keep Helen safe, but the elusive Nick and Joe demanded £500,000 in ransom money. Ian said he spoke to Helen for the last time on a phone belonging to one of the men on April 15th. Following this claim, Ian was presented with 2 men in court. The prosecution believed that they had found the men that Ian had based the descriptions of the kidnappers on. Nick Cook was Stewart's next-door neighbor, and Joe Capullo, who he had known for several years prior in his old home. Ian admitted to knowing both the men, but said they didn't match the description of the kidnappers. Several of Helen's neighbors gave evidence that they had seen Helen walking Boris on the day she disappeared. Another witness claimed that he saw Helen in Broadstairs near her cottage. This was after April 11th, but under cross-examination, this witness admitted that the sighting could have been back in March before she was considered missing, and that he hadn't thought about this sighting until a journalist had interviewed him. After a 7-week trial and just 6 hours of deliberation, on the 22nd of February 2017, the jury found Ian Stewart guilty of the murder of Helen Bailey. At St. Albans Crown Court the next day, Judge Andrew Bright sentenced him. Ian Stewart refused to appear via a video link to hear his sentencing. Judge Bright said it was difficult to imagine a more heinous crime. Ian Stewart was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 34 years. He will be 90 years old before he becomes eligible for parole. DCI Jerome Kent said that although it was the correct and right verdict, were no winners in this case. As a result of this case, detectives began re-examining the death of Ian Stewart's previous wife Diane, who had died after an epileptic seizure at the couple's home in 2010. In August 2018, Ian Stewart was arrested on suspicion of Diane's murder. If all goes to plan, the trial is set for 2022. Helen Bailey helped and inspired so many people with her compassion, openness, and honesty. She met a tragic end at the hands of someone she believed had bought her the happiness she had been missing. The work on her blog Planet Grief and her book When Bad Things Happen in Good Bikinis gave many people suffering from loss and grief support, help, and ultimately hope for the future. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comments section down below. Jill Wendy Dando was born on November 9, 1961 in Somerset, England. She was inquisitive, intelligent, and always hardworking. Knowing exactly what she wanted to do with her career, she studied journalism before going on to work as a trainee reporter for a local newspaper called the Western Mercury, alongside her father and brother. After several years working in different areas and across many fields, she began working for the BBC and quickly moved up the ranks. In early 1988, Jill started presenting the national news in London. She also began presenting television programs such as Breakfast News, the 6 o'clock news, Holiday, and the unsolved crime appeal show Crime Watch. By this point, she was one of the most recognizable faces in the UK, and she was in the home of most families every day. In 1997, she won the BBC's Personality of the Year award and was frequently referred to as the Golden Girl of television. In the same year, she met Alan Farthing, who would later become her fiancé. The wedding was set for September 1999. However, in April of that year, everything would change, and the nation would be left reeling and in complete and utter shock. On the morning of April 26, 1999, 37-year-old Jill Dando left Alan's home in Chiswick. She walked around town for a while, visiting a few shops before leaving the shopping center alone, just after 11 a.m. She then drove back to her house on Gerwin Avenue in Fulham. She didn't regularly spend time at this house as she was in the process of selling it and getting ready for her wedding to Alan. Just as Jill Dando reached the steps at 11:32 a.m., she went to put her keys in the front door and was ambushed from behind. She was pushed onto the ground and her face was pressed into the tiles of her front step. A single shot was fired into her left temple. She had no defensive injuries and it appeared she did not see her attacker coming. She was discovered about 14 minutes later by her neighbor Helen Doble. The front gate was firmly shut and Helen knew she couldn't go past in case she contaminated the crime scene. She phoned 999, while another neighbor that had been alerted by Helen ran to a nearby doctor's surgery for help. Helen told the officers on the phone that she believed Jill was already dead. She initially thought she had been stabbed because of the amount of blood at the scene. Jill Dando reached Charing Cross Hospital at 12:30, where doctors and nurses fought tirelessly in an attempt to save her life. But tragically, she was declared dead at 1:03 p.m. Jill had been killed with a bullet from a 9mm caliber semi-automatic pistol. Further analysis showed that the gun had been pressed directly against her head. Her next-door neighbor Richard said he heard Jill cry out but didn't hear a gunshot. He felt that the cry sounded more like a cry of surprise, as if she was greeting a friend or someone was playing a joke, rather than a cry of fear or something being wrong. When her neighbor Richard looked out of his window, he saw, unbeknownst to him, the killer, a white male with dark hair standing at around 6 foot tall, aged approximately 40 years old. He was quickly walking away from Jill Dando's house. Several of the witnesses said they saw a smartly dressed man talking on a mobile phone, hanging around outside of Jill's house for at least an hour before she returned home. Other people claimed to see a man fitting the same description running near a bus stop and walking across a road near Jill's house. This person, however, did not fit the description of the man seen walking away from the crime scene just seconds after she was shot. It remains unknown whether these people are linked, whether the witnesses that saw the man in the suit had seen the same person, and if the smartly dressed man or men brought any relevance to the case. Detective Chief Inspector Hamish Campbell was heading the investigation, and Jill Dando's death prompted the largest murder inquiry undertaken by the Metropolitan Police Force. The case was also the biggest criminal investigation since the Yorkshire Ripper, and it completely dominated the media. With no CCTV footage of her street, no DNA left by the killer, and the murder weapon being missing, the case would prove difficult from the beginning. The only piece of evidence left at the scene was the bullet that killed Jill Dando. Several theories were presented early on, some of which remain to this day, and some which were ultimately ruled out. Her handbag was still laying by her body, with her mobile phone ringing inside. She was still clutching her house keys, and her jewelry and shopping were still there. The chances of it being a robbery did not seem likely. Some speculated that she had been shot and killed by an obsessed fan. Jill Dando was one of the most well-known public figures in the UK, and likely had numerous fans that were fixated with her. Nigel, Jill's brother, said that in the days leading up to her death, she had complained about a man who was, in her words, pestering her. But CCTV of her last known movements out shopping were carefully looked at, and there appeared to be no evidence of her being followed or watched by anyone, either on foot or by car. Another theory came off the back of her work with the TV show Crime Watch. Jill was one of the faces of the famous show that created reconstructions of unsolved crimes. Had she potentially solved a crime that had put someone in prison and ended up being killed as a result of it? Some argued it was possible that her killer was a hitman potentially hired by someone who had been convicted as a result of Crime Watch. For the crew behind the show, it was a painful time appealing for information about one of their own. But just as the show had done for many others, they created a reconstruction that showed Jill's last movements. They also recreated the sightings of the mystery man or men near her house on the day she had been killed, complete with an e-fit. The theory of this being a professional hit as opposed to a random opportunist was further fueled by analysis of the position of the gun. It is thought that nobody heard the gunshot because the gun was so close to her head, and the position would have acted as a suppressor, muffling the sound. The speed that it all happened, alongside the lack of evidence left at the scene, and the angle that she was shot from, made many think it was a professional job. In the 6 months following on from Jill Dando's death, the police spoke to over 2,500 people. They tracked 1,200 cars and took over 1,000 statements. But despite their best efforts, little turned up. They seemed no closer to working out who had assassinated Jill Dando. The police were under immense pressure to solve the case. It wasn't just the family and friends of Jill that wanted answers. The public and the media wanted answers too. Jill Dando's funeral was held in May of 1999. Hundreds of people filled the streets to say goodbye and pay their respects to one of Britain's best-loved television presenters. It was clear from the outpouring of grief just how loved she was. She was buried next to her mother Winifred, who passed away in 1986. A year after Jill Dando was killed, police finally believed that they had a suspect. Barry George was a local man who lived around half a mile away from Jill's house. He had learning difficulties and an IQ of 75. When psychologists examined him, they concluded he had several different personality disorders: antisocial, histrionic, and narcissistic. Further assessments showed that he also had brain damage. The day after Jill was shot, he had been spotted acting suspiciously. He also had his own history with the law. He had been arrested several times for crimes such as posing as a policeman, and he had also been found on the grounds of Kensington Palace wearing a balaclava. He also had a string of assault charges against his name, so the police quickly mobilized and put him under surveillance. On the May 25, 2000, Barry George was arrested for the murder of Jill Dando, and he was charged with the crime several days later. His trial was held at the Old Bailey, and the prosecution's main piece of evidence was a microscopic particle of gunshot residue that had been found inside the pocket of one of Barry's coats. The gunshot residue matched the particles that were found at the scene. The coat also seemed to match the description of the smart clothing that had been seen on a potential suspect or suspects. On the 1st of July, 2000, Barry George was convicted by a majority of 10-1 and was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Jill Dando. However, various professionals claimed he wasn't capable of committing a crime like that in such a seemingly experienced way due to his learning difficulties. They also said that the evidence that the prosecution had put forward didn't stack up and came from inconsistent stories and statements. They argued Barry George had no motive and that the time frame of the events simply didn't link him to the case. An expert in gunshot residue said that the single particle could have come from a variety of sources and transferred from any number of places. Ultimately, his coat could have been contaminated, and determining where exactly the single particle came from was impossible. His lawyers immediately set out seeking an appeal, believing it to be a grave miscarriage of justice. In 2001, Jill's co-presenter of Crime Watch Nick Ross and Jill's fiancé Alan Farthing began raising money to build an academic institute in her name. After successfully raising almost £1.5 million, University College London created the Jill Dando Institute of Security and Crime Science. It became the first university institute in the world to be devoted specifically to crime science. In the same year, the team from the BBC television show Ground Force designed a memorial garden in Jill's memory. It was full of her favorite colors and plants that were special to her. In 2007, Western College opened a new university campus at the site of the former Sixth Form Center where Jill had studied. The Sixth Form building was named the Jill Dando Center. Barry George's defense team had been continuing to file appeals during these years, and in 2007, after 2 unsuccessful attempts, the case was finally reviewed by the Court of Appeal. Sensationally, they overturned the guilty ruling made previously and set a new trial for June 2008. Except this time the gunshot residue evidence was ruled inadmissible and was not allowed to be used, due to expert opinions that had been previously presented. In August of 2008, Barry George was unanimously acquitted of the murder of Jill Dando. Several newspapers settled with him after he sought damages for articles that had been written about him. He didn't receive any compensation for his time in prison, as it was determined his innocence still hadn't been entirely proven. He now lives in Ireland, but the 8 years he spent inside and the unsolved case of Jill Dando still follows him. To this day, he remains the only person to be put on trial for her murder, and no new arrests have been made since. During Barry George's first trial, the defense put forward another theory as to what could have happened to Jill Dando. Just 3 days before she was shot, British and U.S. warplanes bombed the Radio Television Serbia building in Belgrade. The bombing killed 16 employees, and people wondered if Jill had been killed in retaliation. Just 3 weeks prior to her death, Jill had headed an appeal for the Kosovan Albanian refugees who were fleeing ethnic cleansing in the Balkans. Some people felt that her appeal for aid may have attracted the unwanted attention of Bosnian Serb hardliners, and she had been assassinated as a result. An opposition journalist had been murdered outside of his house in Belgrade before Jill had been killed. The method used in both cases was identical. Just 1 day after the murder of Jill Dando, Tony Hall, who was the BBC's head of news at the time, received a death threat from a man saying he was a Serbian activist. He claimed that he had killed Jill Dando and that Tony Hall would be next. However, the police strongly suspected that this call was nothing more than a hoax. It was determined that the British police never asked the Serbian police for their help, and no police officer ever traveled to Serbia to look into these claims. Ultimately, the police didn't think it was a credible theory. In 2013, Jill's father, Jack Dando, sadly passed away without ever finding out who was responsible for his daughter's death. The case has remained relatively quiet since Barry George's release, but in 2014, a new theory was presented. One of Jill Dando's former colleagues came forward and said that in the months leading up to her death, Jill had been working on exposing a pedophile ring involving some big and well-known names within the BBC. It is alleged that Jill gave a file over to the senior management in the mid-1990s, but the file was handed back to her and an investigation was never carried out. A spokesperson for the BBC said there was nothing that substantiated these claims, and if there was, the allegations would have been looked into. Decades on, Jill's brother Nigel continues the search for answers, but knows that he and the police are up against a lot. He does, however, believe that some of the well-known theories can be ruled out. Nigel said he tends to think that it was not a professional hit that was taken out on Jill, nor does he think there is a Serbian connection. He believes that it was, in his words, simply a misguided individual that knew where Jill lived and was on her street at that time with a firearm. He also said he believes whoever this person was simply struck lucky. Sadly, he feels it is unlikely there will be any answers because of the passage of time. Although some detectives believe that the assassination of Jill Dando will likely never be solved, her family and friends have never given up hope that her killer will eventually be brought to justice. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comments section down below. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. Comedy legend and Saturday Night Live star Philip Edward Hartman started life in Ontario, Canada. Born on September 24, 1948, he came from a big family and began using comedy as a way of getting attention. His family moved to the United States when he was 10 years old, and when Phil started school, he quickly became popular amongst his peers. Always joking and making people laugh, it was clear, although he didn't know it, that performing was in his future. He went to California State University and majored in graphic design, as well as undertaking a public speaking course. He loved the outdoor life and spent lots of time fishing and surfing. He was incredibly creative and went on to design several album covers for well-known bands. In the 1960s, he spent time on the road with many bands and artists. He was immersed in the rock and roll lifestyle, and this further fueled his creative spark. At the beginning of 1970, he met and married his first wife, Gretchen Lewis. However, the marriage quickly dissipated and they divorced just 2 years later. Despite spending many years behind the scenes working with bands and designing album covers, he would quickly fall into the spotlight when he began taking improvisation classes. In 1975, Phil Hartman watched an improv group called the Groundlings. When the group asked for a member of the audience to get involved, Phil said he knew instantly that this was something he had to be part of. He auditioned for and joined a famed improv comedy troupe shortly thereafter. The Groundlings helped birth the careers of stars such as Will Ferrell, Lisa Kudrow, Kathy Griffin, and Jimmy Fallon, amongst many, many others. Another notable star was Paul Reubens, famed for his character P.B. Herman. Phil Hartman helped develop this character with Reubens as they were working on the Pee Wee Herman show for a long time until the pair parted ways after a falling out. After this, his career began to take off even more and he was appearing in various pilots, films, and commercials. His second wife, Lisa Jarvis, said that while Phil's characters were part of himself, they were also like his armor. She said that although he was an entertainer, creative, and passionate at the same time, he was incredibly hard to reach emotionally and withdrew very quickly. A few years after their relationship ended in 1985, Phil met Bryn Armdahl on a blind date. Bryn, originally named Vicky Jo, was stunning and funny, and the chemistry between her and Phil was instant. After modeling for years in her hometown, Bryn made the journey to Los Angeles with the hope of being in show business. She was described as very ambitious and eager to prove herself. It was here that she changed her name from Vicky Jo to Bryn. Before Phil and Bryn met, she had also spent time in rehab for cocaine and Quaalude abuse. Drugs were an ongoing problem, which would mark and impact their relationship throughout its time. Friends would say that when they were good, they were great, but the frequent arguments and volatility between the pair was clear for all to see. In 1986, Phil Hartman made an incredible leap in his career. He was asked to audition for Saturday Night Live. For comedians and comedic actors, SNL was where it was happening, and becoming a cast member was a highly sought-after and coveted job. Onlookers hung on his every word during his audition, and it came as no surprise when he was offered a spot. His impressions of people such as Bill Clinton and Frank Sinatra became iconic, and the audience and cast adored him. His good friend and fellow SNL writer Dana Kaufman described him as a generous and supportive performer that always wanted to make the rest of the cast look as good as possible. SNL put Phil Hartman and his amazing comedic capabilities firmly in the public eye, and he soon became a fan favorite. He won an Emmy for his contributions to the Saturday Night Live writing team. He was also nicknamed Glue by fellow performers for his abilities to hold the show together and help out the other performers where needed. Despite their issues, Bryn and Phil married in 1987 and quickly became quite the Hollywood power couple. At the end of Phil Hartman's second season of Saturday Night Live, he and Bryn welcomed their first child, a son named Sean. Upon hearing the joyful news, Phil's ex-wife Lisa Jarvis sent a letter to the family offering to help look after the baby should they ever need it. She said she receives an abusive death threat back from Bryn. Phil took to being a father quickly, and his baby boy, Sean, was his pride and joy. The family began splitting their time between New York and Los Angeles, and he and Bryn had a second baby, a little girl named Bergen. Phil and Bryn seemed to have it all, but friends of the star said it was clear that the cracks in the relationship were very apparent. People that knew the couple said that Phil didn't like confrontation and struggled to open up emotionally, whereas Bryn was very vocal but often chose the worst times to start the conversations. Bryn began to show up to the Saturday Night Live set more frequently, and cast and crew members often saw heated arguments between the two. During a table read through for a new episode of the show, Bryn turned up to the set and began sitting on various men's laps and flirting with different people. Although Phil didn't seem to pay much attention in a bid to keep the peace, the other cast members were left feeling uncomfortable. People felt this was an attempt by Bryn to get attention from Phil, as she was feeling lonely and insecure in the marriage. As well as prescription drugs, Bryn had relapsed and started drinking and using cocaine again. Although this was noticed by members of the SNL cast, it wasn't uncommon at the time. Alcohol and drugs were a frequent feature among many a dressing room, with some stars as famous for their drug-taking as their comedy. Friends also said that Bryn had become resentful of Phil's career and wanted her own shot at being in the limelight. Phil argued that he was the breadwinner for the family and everything he did was for them. Phil also told friends that he would often have to restrain Bryn when she became physical during fights. As well as his work on SNL, Phil accepted various roles on The Simpsons, further cementing his place in pop culture. In 1995, after 8 seasons on Saturday Night Live, Phil Hartman decided to step away from the show. He is still regarded as one of the finest comedic talents to ever appear on SNL, and fellow cast and crew members said there was a definite void when he left. He was working hard on a pilot for his show entitled The Phil Show, in which he would make sure Bryn got a leading role. However, the pilot never made it to air, and Bryn was reportedly devastated at not being able to work with her husband on this project. Instead, Phil signed up to be part of a new sitcom called News Radio, working alongside many a famous face. He was earning around $50,000 an episode and was at the height of his career. Bryn and their 2 children moved permanently to a $1.4 million mansion in Encino, California, for Phil to focus on the sitcom and his family. Despite his professional accolades, he couldn't escape his personal turmoil in his marriage, and the explosive arguments continued. On Mother's Day 1997, Bryn came home late, reportedly drunk and high on cocaine. Phil was horrified and said if this behavior continued, he would have to divorce her and take the children. He said if she didn't check into rehab, the marriage was over. Bryn checked into a rehab in Arizona the following day, but left after less than a week, claiming she didn't need to be there. After a 4th season of News Radio was commissioned, Phil decided to take a summer break to spend more time with his family and work on his marriage. Phil and Bryn Hartman also reached their 11-year anniversary. May 27, 1998. Despite their marital issues, they always aimed to have a weekly date night, while their children spent time with a nanny. On May 27th, their day began with the couple talking about what they would do for their weekly date. According to sources, Phil had gotten his days confused and forgotten about the date nights, which sparks yet another argument. Phil left the family home to go shopping and get some space, and Bryn decided she was going to head out too. Leaving the children with the nanny, she started getting ready for an evening out with a friend. At some time around 7:30 p.m., Bryn Hartman went to meet her friend Christine Zander for dinner and drinks, telling the nanny she would be home to see the children off to bed. Christine Zander was a producer and writer, and friends of Bryn speculated she may have been hoping for Christine to create a part for her in an upcoming project. Her friend Christine said she did seem in good spirits and in a positive frame of mind. Around 9:30 p.m., Phil arrived at home and let the nanny go. He put the children to bed and headed to bed himself. Around 9:45, Bryn asked Christine if she wanted to carry on drinking in another bar, but Christine couldn't stay out any later. While Christine went to the bathroom, she said that Bryn made a phone call, which she was worried may have been to score drugs. They said their goodbyes and went their separate ways. At 10:15 p.m., Bryn drove across town to Studio City to go to her friend and ex-lover Ron Douglas' house. They drank beer and caught up, with Bryn attempting to briefly call Phil, but he didn't pick up the phone. Just before midnight, Ron told Bryn that it was best for her to head home as he didn't want any issues with Phil. When Bryn arrived home at around 1 a.m., she began using cocaine. Although what happened next is speculation, it is understood that she and Phil would have argued. Phil didn't want to fight and decided to go back to sleep, leaving Bryn to her own devices. Sometime before 3 a.m., Bryn, already intoxicated, snorted another line of cocaine and grabbed one of Hartman's many guns. She entered the bedroom and shot her husband 3 times as he slept, between the eyes, in the throat, and in his chest. Their 9-year-old son Sean woke up to what he thought was a door slamming, and he heard his mother crying. Heavily intoxicated, manic, and in a state of shock, Bryn got in her car and drove to see her friend, Ron Douglas. She was frantic and immediately confessed to killing Phil. However, due to Bryn's often erratic nature, Ron didn't initially believe her. It was clear that she was in a drug-induced state, and he assumed that they had simply had another argument. He attempted to sober her up, and at around 6 a.m., Ron was fairly satisfied that she was able to drive. But Bryn wanted Ron to go back to the house with her. Ron said that while they were talking, a gun fell out of Bryn's purse, and he immediately knew he had to follow her car back to the house. Upon entering the bedroom, Ron saw Phil Hartman. It was clear that nothing could be done, and he was already deceased. Ron Douglas phoned 911. During this time, Bryn barricaded herself in the bedroom with Phil's body. She phoned her sister and asked her to take care of Sean and Bergen. At 6:20 a.m., the police surrounded Hartman's home. They find a visibly distressed Sean at the front of the house. Hearing the police encroaching, Bryn lay next to her husband and shot herself. As the story began to break, the world was in a state of shock. In the days and weeks following on from the devastating event, many theories began to circulate, one of which was there was an affair going on between Ron Douglas and Bryn Hartman, which culminated in a crime of passion. Another theory was that Bryn was hoping to attempt to frame Ron for the murder, and that's why she drove to his house with the gun. No theory has ever been proven. Ron Douglas flatly denied any involvement and said that until he got to the house, he had no idea what had happened. It will never be known what was going on inside the mind of Bryn Hartman in the early hours of May 28th. As well as a high level of cocaine, the antidepressant Zoloft was in Bryn's system and her blood alcohol level was 0.12%, well above the legal limit. Brynna told friends that she had been prescribed Zoloft by her children's doctor, but that it made her feel strange and out of her own body. Medical examiners looked into the side effect of Zoloft and whether this could have altered her state of mind that night. As well as disorientation and hallucinations, it can occasionally bring on suicidal feelings. Many of Bryn's family members believe this drug could have played a key role in the events that took place that fateful night. In 1999, the Hartman estate filed a lawsuit against Pfizer, the pharmaceutical company that produces the drug Zoloft, claiming there were little warnings about the side effects and danger of mixing the drug with alcohol. The family did receive an out-of-court settlement from Pfizer before it ever went to court. However, the theory surrounding the impact of Zoloft remains an uncertain area, as levels of the drug in Bryn's system were low, according to the toxicology report. In the early hours of May 28, 1999, 2 young children lost their parents, family and friends lost their loved ones, and the world felt the loss of an incredible talent. Sean and Bergen Hartman went to live with their aunt and uncle in Wisconsin and were raised under a different name to shield them from the public eye. Sean took after his father and is an artist and musician, carving a creative career for himself. Bergen has degrees in journalism and communication from university and has her own business. She even made a special appearance on SNL's 40th anniversary celebration in 2015 to honor her father. Both children dedicated a memorial to their parents in Greenwood Cemetery. The deaths of Phil and Bryn Hartman shocked the world. But Phil Hartman's amazing comedic talents continue to live on through the world of entertainment. His friends, family, and their children. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comment section down below. October 8, 1975. The body of a little girl is found by the side of a remote road. She's lying in the grass, face down in the mud. She has been subjected to a horrifying sexual assault and has been stabbed a shocking 12 times, with one of the stab wounds piercing her heart. What had started as a missing child investigation had now become a major murder inquiry. Little do people know at the time is that it will lead to one of the most appalling miscarriages of justice in British criminal history. At around lunchtime on October 5, 1975, 11-year-old Leslie Molseed was asked to go to the shop by her mother. The family used a rotor to ensure that all children did chores, and children in the area were often trusted to run small errands for their parents. They lived on Delamere Road in Rochdale, Greater Manchester. Danny, her stepfather, and her two sisters. Life for Leslie, often called Lel by her mother, hadn't always been easy. She had been born with a congenital cardiac condition, and an operation to correct this at the age of 3 had left her frail, with a reduced mental level for her age. She was told by her mother to go and buy some bread and air freshener from a nearby shop located on Ansdell Road, and in her blue raincoat, little Leslie set off. She was spotted walking on the secluded Steelups Lane. Then, she vanished. When Leslie failed to return home quickly, April became concerned and sent her siblings out to see if they could find her. And Danny soon joined in the search too. The family looked everywhere they could think of, but Leslie couldn't be found, and there was no evidence that she had made it to the shops. At 3 p.m., and with no trace of her anywhere, the family frantically contacted Rochdale police. Investigators quickly mobilized and formed a search. They checked the town and local area, interviewing people and looking everywhere to try and find the vulnerable young girl. While the police were searching for Leslie, for girls aged 12, 13, 16, and 18 came forward to the police. They told officers that a man had exposed himself to them the day before Leslie had gone missing. With a missing child and these 4 girls now saying this, the police quickly pursued the lead. He was soon identified as 23-year-old Stefan Kisko. Stefan was a local tax clerk. His parents had emigrated to the UK from Eastern Europe following the end of the Second World War. Outside of his mother and aunt, he didn't have a social life. His father had suffered a heart attack 5 years before, and he had died at Stefan's feet. He also had learning difficulties, meaning he had the mental age of around 12 years old. Despite him never having been in trouble with the law, the police quickly determined that he was the man they were looking for. With his poor social skills, his odd habits including writing down registration plates of cars that annoyed him, and with the testimony of the 4 girls saying he had exposed himself, the police were determined to prove that he was their man. Just 3 days after Leslie had vanished, the worst fears of everyone were realized. Her little body was found by the side of a road. She had been brutally attacked and stabbed to death in a horrifying, frenzied attack. Her appalling death left the local community in shock. It made headlines around the country and left her family utterly devastated. On the 21st of December, 1975, Stefan Kisko was arrested on suspicion of murder. He was intensely questioned, with his story being picked apart by the police. After 3 days, he confessed. On Christmas Eve, 1975, Stefan Kisko was charged with the murder of 11-year-old Leslie Molseed. Not long after, Stefan retracted his confession in the presence of a solicitor, but this made no difference. His trial began in Leeds in July of 1976, and Stefan's defense lawyer was David Waddington. David Waddington was a successful lawyer and member of the Queen's Council. Stephen again repeated that he hadn't killed Leslie and that his confession was false. When asked why he had admitted it, he replied, "And they seemed to please them and the pressure was off as far as I was concerned. I thought if I admitted what I did to police, they would check out what I said, find it untrue, and would then let me go." On the 21st of July, 1976, the jury returned after 5.5 hours of deliberation. Stephen Kisco was found guilty by a 10-2 majority. The judge sentenced him to life in prison for the murder of Leslie Molseed. The girls who had come forward saying he had exposed himself were praised by the judge for their bravery and honesty in telling the court their story. The officers were also praised by the judge for their great skill in bringing to justice the person responsible for this dreadful crime, adding, "I would like all the officers responsible for the result to be specially commended," and these observations conveyed to the chief constable. The mother of one of the girls said that Stephen should have been arrested sooner and called for him to be hanged. She said, "Children are a lot safer. Now this monster has been put away." Kisco was soon transferred to Wakefield Prison. As he was now not only a convicted sex offender but a child killer, he had to be placed on a Rule 43 to protect him from other inmates. 3 years later, Stephen launched an appeal, but this was dismissed. Lord Justice Bridge said, "We can find no grounds whatsoever to condemn the jury's verdict of murder as in any way unsafe or unsatisfactory. The appeal is dismissed." While in prison, Stephen was attacked by fellow inmates. One of these incidents left him needing stitches. As his mental health started to deteriorate, he developed schizophrenia and began to suffer from delusions. His protestations of innocence were labeled as a symptom of his delusions. He was moved from prison to prison, but in 1991 he was admitted to Ashworth Hospital after 6 months of delay for treatment of his declining mental health. She was adamant that he hadn't murdered Leslie Molseed and that he had confessed under duress. She took it to her local MP Cyril Smith, but he ignored her pleas for assistance in reopening Stephen's case. She was also stonewalled by Prime Minister James Callaghan and his successor Margaret Thatcher. In 1984, she contacted the human rights organization Justice, who examined miscarriages of justice, and in 1987 she was put in contact with Solicitor Campbell Malone. Malone agreed to take on Stephen's case. He consulted with Philip Clegg, who had served as junior defense counsel under Waddington in Stephen's original trial. Clegg had expressed the doubts he had at the time about Stephen's confession and subsequent conviction, and the pair worked together for the next 2 years on a petition for the Home Secretary. The final draft was ready to send to the Home Secretary on the 26th of October, 1989. Coincidentally, that same day, David Waddington was appointed to that very position. He would resign in 1990 in order to take up peerage and become leader of the House of Lords. He was replaced by Kenneth Baker. It would be 16 months before a police investigation into the trial would begin. In February 1991, after receiving help from a private detective named Peter Jackson, Malone finally convinced the Home Secretary that the case must be reopened. It was then sent to West Yorkshire Police, headed by Detective Superintendent Trevor Wilkinson. This would set in motion an extraordinary chain of events that would blow the case wide open. The police soon discovered that Stephen hadn't been asked if he wanted a lawyer, although during that time suspects didn't have the right to have a solicitor present. He had asked for his mother Charlotte to be there, but this was refused despite his learning difficulties. Crucially, the police didn't caution him until long after they had decided he was the man they were looking for. The semen found on Leslie's body was also re-examined. Wilkinson found that Stephen was infertile and incapable of producing semen, meaning the sample found on Leslie's body physically could not have come from him. It soon became apparent that they were now dealing with one of the most grave miscarriages of justice the United Kingdom had ever seen. Not only was Stephen Kisco an innocent man who had been in prison since 1976, this also meant that whoever had killed Leslie was still at large. The evidence of the semen had been suppressed by the police and never disclosed to either the defense team nor the jury. They also found that a witness had seen Stephen visiting the grave of his father on the day Leslie had been murdered, and the witness couldn't understand why they hadn't been called to testify. The errors in the investigation just kept on coming. A few months before the murder, Stephen had broken his ankle. This, coupled with the fact he was overweight, meant it would have been incredibly difficult for him to scale the slope where Leslie had been found. This evidence was also not shown to the court. The catalog of errors made by his legal counsel were also in the firing line when it became apparent how badly they had handled his defense. On the first morning of the trial, the Crown delivered thousands of pages of additional unused material. This is where the defense counsel made a huge mistake. They didn't ask for an adjournment to examine them. Instead, they let the trial continue. They used the defense of diminished responsibility, a defense that Stephen hadn't agreed to. They said that he had murdered Leslie after receiving testosterone to treat hypogonadism, and this might have made him behave strangely. The endocrinologist who was treating Stephen vehemently disagreed with this argument, saying the treatment would not have led to that kind of behavior, much less make him inclined to kill. His endocrinologist was never called to testify to this effect. The 4 girls who said that Stephen had exposed himself to them were now aged 27, 28, 31, and 33. They also had something to say. They admitted they had made up the allegation against Stephen and that he hadn't committed indecent exposure. They said they had done it for a laugh and that at the time it was funny. One of them was interviewed by police on Valentine's Day, 1991. She said she wished she hadn't said anything and that she didn't think at the time it would go that far. She said she had gone along with what one of the other girls had said. Another one of the girls said they had seen someone urinating in public, but it wasn't Stephen. She also refused to apologize. One of them was a friend of Leslie's older sister, and she expressed the most remorse. She hadn't been called to testify along with the other 3, but said that if she had, she would have told the truth and not committed perjury like the others had. 2 of the girls received a formal caution by police for the criminal offense they had committed. In August 1991, the new findings were presented to the Home Secretary Kenneth Baker. He immediately handed it over to the Court of Appeal. The judicial investigation began on February 17, 1992. After hearing the plethora of new evidence that proved the wrong man had been convicted, Lord Chief Justice Lane said, "It has been shown that this man cannot produce sperm. This man consequently cannot have been the murderer." And with that, Stephen Kisco was declared an innocent man and his immediate release from custody was demanded. Anthony Beaumont Dark, a Conservative MP, said, "This must be the worst miscarriage of justice of all time. It brings shame on everyone involved in the case." This brought a fresh heartbreak for the family of Leslie Molseed. Not only did they now have to contend with the fact that an innocent man had gone to prison, but that Leslie's murderer was still out there. During the original trial, they had demanded that Stephen be publicly hanged, and Leslie's father, Frederick Anderson, had shouted a torrent of abuse at Charlotte Kisco after her son had been convicted. After Stephen was proven innocent, the Molseed family publicly apologized for what they had said. Lord Lane himself, Ronald Outeridge, the forensic scientist who had worked on the case, and the prosecution barrister Peter Taylor all offered no apology, nor did any of them express any words of remorse or regret for what had happened. The original trial judge, Hugh Park, said that while he was sorry for what had happened to Stephen, he was not sorry for how he had handled the trial. The police admitted that they had been wrong, but tried to justify the action taken in 1975. All David Waddington said was that had all the evidence been available to him in 1976, the case would have taken a different course. Stephen required further psychiatric treatment until April 1992. He was then released. He had spent more than 16 years in custody. The hunt was now on to find the real killer of Leslie Molseed. The first problem was that in 1985, when was Stephen in prison and the case being closed, the clothes belonging to Leslie that had been taken from the crime scene had been destroyed. Fortunately, the strips used to remove fibers from Leslie's clothes had been kept. In 1997, a former detective wrote a book about the murder of Leslie Molseed and named Raymond Hewlett as the man who had most likely taken her life. Hewlett had served with the Scots Guards before becoming a fairground worker. It was after this that he committed a string of appalling sexual assaults. He was sent to prison in 1972 after using paint thinner on a cloth to incapacitate a 12-year-old girl before attacking her on the moors close to his home in Todmaiden. Fortunately, she was able to escape. Just 6 years later, another girl was attacked after he pointed a gun at her back. but thankfully she too was able to get away. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison for that offense. Despite 2 stints in prison in 1988, he committed another attack against a newspaper delivery girl, and he was jailed once again. After this came to light, the family of Leslie Molseed campaigned in Todmorden where he'd lived. They gave out flyers and demanded justice for Leslie. The samples from Leslie's clothes were sent to the Forensic Services Lab in Wetherby, West Yorkshire. After tests, they were able to extract a profile. And finally, in 1999, they had the full DNA profile of Leslie Molseed's killer, but he wasn't on the National DNA Database. In 2003, DNA profiling was introduced, and this meant the police could check Hewlett's DNA against that of the samples from the crime scene. Came back as no match. The DNA wasn't Raymond Hewlett's. The police were back at square one. Alongside Raymond Hewlett, another suspect who was soon ruled out was Michael Horgan, who also had a criminal record involving horrific child abuse. In 2001, the News of the World newspaper ran an article saying that they had discovered evidence that Raymond Hewlett, Michael Horgan, a third man, were potentially involved in Leslie's death. This was prior to the DNA profiling result. They alleged that Horgan had groomed Leslie in the weeks leading up to her being murdered. This, like all the other stories, would go nowhere, as despite their horrendous criminal convictions, the men had nothing to do with the death of Leslie Molseed. It is worth noting that following a lengthy inquiry known as the Leveson Inquiry into the culture, tactics, and ethics of the British press, the News of the World newspaper was shut down in 2011 after a plethora of journalistic malpractice and phone hacking scandals were uncovered. In November 2006, the news came that people had waited more than 30 years to hear. The police had arrested a man after having a direct hit with the DNA taken from the scene. The suspect had provided a DNA sample after being arrested in connection with another sex attack the previous year, and while he wasn't charged with that offense, when they had ran it through the DNA database, it came back as a direct match to a sample found on Leslie's body. The suspect was named as 53-year-old Ronald Castry. Castry was originally from the Turfel estate in Rochdale and had worked as a taxi driver before becoming a comic book dealer. His dreadful reputation preceded him. He was heavily disliked by his neighbors, who said he had an extremely nasty temper. He had an abusive relationship with his wife, and the marriage had ended in divorce in 1997. They shared 2 children, and 2 weeks before Leslie had been murdered, his wife had given birth to a baby that wasn't his. On the day of the murder, she had gone back into hospital, leaving him alone at home. When the police looked into Castry's background, they found a disturbing history of convictions. In 1973, he abducted and sexually assaulted a 9-year-old girl. He was charged £50 for the offenses of incitement to commit gross indecency and indecent assault. 3 years later, he was convicted again of indecently assaulting a 7-year-old boy. He was told to pay a fine of £50. Ronald Castry was subsequently charged with the murder of Leslie Molseed. He appeared in court on the 7th of November 2006 and was remanded in custody. In April the following year, Castry entered his plea, not guilty. He was refused bail and sent back to prison to await his trial. During the trial, Dr. Gemma Eskett told the jury that the chances of the semen coming from anyone other than Ronald Castry was more than 1 in a billion. The court heard how Castry had abducted Leslie from the street near her home. He then drove her to Rishworth Moor, sexually assaulted her, then stabbed her to death in a frenzied, brutal, and savage attack, before leaving her body at the side of the road. On the November 12, 2007, the verdict was returned. Ronald Castry was found guilty of the murder of Leslie Molseed. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum tariff of 30 years, meaning before he can even apply for parole, it will be 2036 and he will be 83 years old. The fallout from the case of Leslie Molseed was both unprecedented and immeasurable. Leslie's family had to go through the trauma of 2 murder trials, as well as the difficult realization that the man who had murdered their beloved Leslie had been walking free for so long. Tragically, in 2014, Leslie's mother April died at the age of 74. In 1994, the surviving senior officer who had worked the original case, Detective Superintendent Dick Holland, as well as the forensic scientist who had worked the case too, Ronald Outeridge, were formally charged with doing acts tending to pervert the course of justice by allegedly suppressing evidence that proved Stefan's innocence. including the scientific tests done on the semen. In May the following year, the case was challenged by defense barristers who argued that the passage of time had made a fair trial impossible and that the case was an abusive process. The presiding magistrate agreed, and the case was not put to a jury. Dick Holland had also served as an officer in the case of Judith Ward, who was accused of committing an IRA bomb attack in 1974. Her conviction would later be declared unsafe, and she was freed after 17 years in prison. Like Stephen, her case was considered to be one of the most egregious miscarriages of justice in British criminal history. Holland retired from the force in 1988 and died at the age of 74 in 2007. After Stephen had been released, he was left a physically and emotionally broken man. He became a virtual recluse and showed little interest in anything. When people would approach him to apologize or offer support or encouragement, it would often frighten him. Upon his release, Stephen was promised £500,000 in compensation for his time in prison. He received an interim payment, but never the full amount. As on the 23rd of December, 1993, less than 2 years after being released from prison, Stephen Kisco suffered a massive heart attack and died at the age of 41. For months later, his mother Charlotte, who had fought tirelessly for her son, died at the age of 70. The pair are buried together in Rochdale Cemetery. While in prison, Stephen wrote to a family friend saying, "I am in prison for a crime I have not committed. I am missing my mother very much. I hope there will be a happy ending." In 1992, following Stephen's release, the two families who had been torn apart by the murder of Leslie, the Molseeds, and the Kishkos, met in person to begin the healing process. Leslie's father, Frederick Anderson, said, "I wasn't sure whether she would accept me into her home. I said some horrible things about Charlotte at the trial for which I cannot apologize enough." Charlotte Kishko harbored no ill will towards the family, saying, "I never blame the family for what happened to Stephen. I have got my son back, but that little girl can never be replaced." What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comment section down below. Jodie Meyers' family described her as someone that loved life and lived it to the fullest. Always positive and smiling, 20-year-old Jodie was a doting mother to her baby boy Elijah. Those that knew her said becoming a mum was the best thing that ever happened to her, and her son was her whole world. 2-year-old Elijah's father was 29-year-old Neil Archer. He and Jodie were engaged and lived together in Manham, South Australia. Just down the road from them live Neil's mother Margaret and her husband Lawrence. August 26, 2015, Jodie and Neil were invited to Jodie's stepfather's birthday party. Jodie spent time with her family enjoying the barbecue and campfire. But Neil never emerged from the car and refused to engage in the celebrations or accept any of the food. He just sat in the car and waited for Jodie. Jodie joined Neil and they both drove home together. 2 days later, Lucy, Jodie's mother, got a text message from Jodie's phone. The message said that she had left Neil and gone to stay with some friends while she sorted everything out. But she hadn't taken Elijah with her, and Lucy knew Jodie would never have left her baby boy behind. Lucy replied to the message but got no response back. She showed the message to her eldest daughter and her reaction was the same as Lucy's. This wasn't Jodie texting. They went straight to the police with their concerns. Detectives in the team at the Major Crime Squad agreed and felt it was highly unlikely that Jodie would have just upped and left, especially without her son. As word spread about Jodie's strange disappearance, her fiancé, Neil, and his mother, Margaret, started making pleas for her to come home. Neil and his mother, Margaret, told the police that they had seen Jodie leave in a red car with a mystery couple. They said they didn't know the couple, but they hoped that they were looking after Jodie while she took some space and time for herself. News outlets circulated images of the car, hoping for it to jog someone's memory. Several weeks would pass, with still no sighting of or word from Jodie. Searches were being conducted throughout the town and alongside the bank of the River Murray, but no clues turned up anywhere. A small glimmer of hope came when they looked into Jodie's bank records and found that $250 had been withdrawn from her account at a nearby ATM machine. This $250 was the last of her savings, and just hours later, her phone suddenly had credit in it before the message was sent to her mum Lucy. Police set about obtaining any and all the footage they could from that street to see if they could spot Jodie. While the police were working on this, Neil and Margaret were fast becoming a regular feature on the local news, and reporters were firing some tough questions at Neil. The more the pair spoke to the media and inserted themselves into the investigation, the more people started to question them. Jodie's family had concerns about Neil from the get-go. They said he didn't fit in with the rest of the family and made no effort to do so. He never came across as someone that was a reliable and stable presence in Jodie's life. Jodie's brother-in-law Michael said that he was always a little off-center from everything. Jodie's mother was also hesitant about the relationship from the beginning. She said she felt Jodie made out to family and friends that she was happier than she actually was. At one point, Jodie had said she could finally start to see what Neil was trying to do, which was take her away from her family. Neil's behavior became more controlling and manipulative. He always had to have access to her Facebook account and stopped her from going to see people without him. Neil had to know where Jodie was and who she was with all the time. Another source of tension was Margaret Archer. Margaret was the mother of 4 boys. She raised her sons in Adelaide before moving to a housing estate in the small town of Manham, South Australia. Neil lived with her until his mid-20s. That was until he met Jodie. Margaret adored Neil and her grandson Elijah, but she showed very little care for Jodie. It's said that Margaret would often take Elijah inside and lock Jodie out of the house, keeping him from her. The relationship between Neil and Jodie became more and more toxic, and by early 2015, Jodie confided in her family that she wanted to leave him. Neil caught wind of this and blamed Jodie's family for getting involved in the relationship. Jodie's brother-in-law Michael told Neil if Jodie wanted to leave, he had 2 choices: fight for her and try and work through it, or just walk away and let her live her life. Neil turned to him, emotionless, and said, "I will kill her." By mid-September, Neil Archer was officially named as a person of interest. Police now had reason to believe that Jodie had been met with foul play and was likely deceased. Once the CCTV near the ATM machine had been processed, police could finally see exactly who it was withdrawing the money. Margaret Archer was seen withdrawing the $250. She was wearing a gray hoodie and dark trousers, while Neil, wearing a baseball cap, leant against the wall waiting for her and keeping an eye out down the street. Footage then picked up Neil and Margaret in Neil's green Ford, driving and then parking outside a news agency. Margaret entered the news agency and bought a $10 credit voucher for a phone. After she left the shop, she headed back to the car where she and Neil waited for 6 minutes. During this time, the text that raised the red flag was sent from Jodie's phone to her mother. After the message was sent, the pair drove back. Just the day after Jodie was last seen, CCTV footage showed Margaret at Bunnings warehouse buying over 600 kilograms of cement, paid for with the cash she had taken from Jodie's bank account. Lawrence, Margaret's husband, had been away in Tasmania when Jodie disappeared, and when he returned, he was surprised to see that the shed floor had been newly concreted. Neil said they had done it as a Father's Day gift for him, and said that Neil just wasn't the kind of guy to do something like that for somebody else. Lawrence innocently revealed all of this to the police. With all of this evidence mounting up and the police slowly closing in, it wasn't long before Neil cracked under pressure. One day, with Margaret out the house, Neil decided it was time to confide in his brother Aaron. In the laundry room of the house, Neil bluntly said, "I killed her," and then quickly went to leave. But his brother stopped him in his tracks and demanded to know why he had done it. Neil said he knew Jodie was about to leave him and take Elijah too. Again, after admitting this, he hastily tried to walk away, but Aaron still had no intention of letting him leave. "How?" he asked him. Neil told him he had strangled Jodie in their home before taking her body to his mother's house and burying her under the tool shed. Aaron said his eyes were black, like nothing there. "It was scary. It scared the shit out of me." Aaron insisted Neil turn himself in, but when he didn't, Aaron decided to do it for him. Before long, police were at Margaret Archer's property, and Neil Archer was charged with murder. Jodie Meyers' body was discovered in a shallow grave under the concrete slab Neil had laid. This was just meters from where the pair had been courting the media and begging for Jodie's safe return. It was later confirmed that Jodie had been strangled with the cord from one of Neil's hoodies. Margaret Archer was later charged with helping Neil cover up the crime. Neil Archer eventually pled guilty to the murder of 20-year-old Jodie Meyers, sparing her family the agony of sitting through a painful trial. Under state law, he faced a non-parole period of at least 20 years, but he believed he deserved a special parole term because he had pled guilty in the first place. This came after a separate murder case upheld a non-parole period of 15 years for special reasons. Neil was hoping for the same ruling, and the court heard he was actually eligible for a 30% discount. Despite this, he was sentenced to life in prison with a non-parole period of 20 years for the murder of Jodie Meyers. Justice Trish Kelly said applying the full discount would have been disproportionate to the seriousness of the offense, and would be so inappropriate that it would shock the public conscience. The following year, Margaret Archer also pled guilty in the district court to one count of assisting an offender. She was sentenced to 6.5 years with a minimum non-parole period of 4 years. However, her sentence was backdated to when she was taken into custody back in December 2015, which means she was eligible for parole in 2019. Despite the police and Jodie's family's beliefs, Margaret still maintains she had nothing to do with the murder itself. Jodie's son Elijah now lives with his grandmother Lucy. Elijah keeps a photo of Jodie with him all the time so he can carry on sharing things with her. Lucy said that one Christmas Elijah got a bicycle. He took the photo of his mother out to show her his gift, and then sat the photo on the table so she could watch him ride his new bike. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comments section down below.